Hi everybody, Billy Obenauer here, and thanks for joining me for this lesson. In this video, we're going to be talking about the role of the organizational environment and your organizational culture in how you manage. We're going to open this lesson by describing the 5 elements of an organization's macro environment. Then we're going to explain 5 components of the organization's competitive environment, talk about what managers can do to stay on top of changes in their external environment, talk a little bit about how managers can respond to changes in the external environment, and then finally we'll talk about how managers can use organizational culture to overcome challenges in the external environment. Let's begin by defining a few key terms. First term we're going to go over today is an open system. And this basically deals with how organizations can affect and are affected by their environments and other systems. Okay, so let's start thinking about this here. What does this mean organizations can affect and are affected by? Well, how are organizations affected by their environment? Let's think of a few examples. Well, for one, if the economy is really good and people have a lot of disposable income, then they have more money to shop with, right? So they can spend more money at retailers, they can spend more money at restaurants. So that's one way that the economy can impact organizations. All right. Maybe we have high unemployment rates. And if we have high unemployment rates, that means there's a lot of people who are actively looking for work but out of work. And in that type of situation, when organizations need to find employees, they have a lot to choose from. But if we have a low unemployment rate, meaning that there are not a lot of people who are actively looking for work, then organizations may have more trouble filling some of their open positions. Okay, so how do organizations affect their environment? Well, if my sales are growing, I'm probably going to have to hire more people. Okay, so I'm going to hire more people. The unemployment rate will decrease. People will have more disposable income because they'll be working and so on and so forth. Another way that organizations can impact their environment is through their innovation. All right, so Apple puts the iPhone out there and all of a sudden the whole world changes. Okay, these are some basic ways that organizations can impact their environment. They also can impact their environment through things such as political action committees and some of the movements that organizations get involved in. So I think back to my time at the Home Depot. When I was at the Home Depot, this was back in like the 2009, 2010 time. And at that point in time, we had online retailers were not always being required to collect sales tax. So if you bought something from Amazon, they didn't necessarily have to charge you sales tax on that. But if you bought something from us online, if we had a brick and mortar store in your state, which chances were we did, we were required to collect sales tax. So that put us at a little bit of a disadvantage. Not that people were buying plywood and lumber from Amazon, but they might buy lock sets, faucets, vanities, other things that were expensive and high margin. So it did matter. And now, if our sales tax in the state that we're in is, say, 7 or 8%, and you have to pay that if you purchase from us, but you don't if you purchase from Amazon, that gives them a distinct competitive advantage. So the company was involved in a lot of different ways that it was trying to address the presence of this competitive advantage. And one way was when we showed up for our annual meeting in Las Vegas, where you have about 2,000 members of the management team showing up. They had letters for each of us there to sign, one for each of our senators and one for our representative in the House of Representatives, basically asking them to work on legislation to address this issue. And those letters were ready for us at registration. So you showed up, you went to pick up your packet, and they asked you if you'd like to sign these letters. So as a result of that, there was a large push coming from management employees at the company putting out letters asking legislators to address this environmental issue as far as government regulation was concerned. Within an open system, we have inputs and outputs. And we talked a little bit about these in chapter 2, so I'm not going to spend too much time on them here. But basically, inputs are what we use to create our products and services, and outputs are the products and services that we create. So if you were running a pizzeria, some of your inputs might be cheese, dough, sauce, labor, electricity, maybe fuel if you have a gas powered oven. Okay, all these things here would be your inputs, and then the output that would come out of everything over here on the left is we would create a pizza. The external environment refers to all the relevant forces outside of your firm's boundaries. Okay, so things like the law, things like the actual weather, the economy, all these other types of things that we've been discussing in this lesson. Okay, now your book talks a lot about the company Sport Clips, and one of the examples that it gives with Sport Clips is how the founder of the company recognized that there was an opportunity within the men's haircut market. Okay, that there was demand for a specific type of haircut establishment and that demand wasn't being met. So what he did was he built a business that was designed to meet that demand within the external environment. The macro environment is a portion of the external environment that really is more general in nature. Okay, and elements within the macro environment are some things that we've already mentioned, such as laws and regulation, the economy, technology, demographics, and social values. All right, and while large organizations may be able to have some type of impact on the macro environment, in many ways, the macro environment can be uncontrollable. The first component of the macro environment that we're going to discuss is laws and regulations. And here we have a list of examples of regulators in the United States of America. So we have the National Labor Relations Board. And what this organization here does is they basically set the rules and govern how unions can organize and operate in the workplace. All right. So they're the organization that really helps to protect people from getting fired when they try to start a union and so on. Then we have the Federal Communications Commission, and the FCC makes rules to regulate what can be said on television and on the radio. Then we have the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which, as you would probably guess, has some say in regulations related to nuclear power plants and so on. Then we have Safety and Health Administration, and OSHA really is responsible for making rules that help to ensure that we have a safe workplace. All right, they also help to protect workers by giving them a way that they can report unsafe work practices and protecting them from retaliation when they do report unsafe work practices. Then we have the Environmental Protection Agency, which sets rules and regulations related to the environment, the Federal Reserve System that sets rules related to financial issues, and the Food and Drug Administration. Now, managers can be challenged by laws or they can benefit from them. And when we say that managers can be challenged by laws, that doesn't necessarily mean that the laws are bad. It just means that they added additional complexity to what a manager needs to do. Okay, so for example, if we think about environmental regulations, we can think about products that we have to recycle because they create environmental hazards. So let's look at 4 foot fluorescent light bulbs. Now, years ago, these used to just get thrown in the dumpster, okay? But those light bulbs have mercury in them. It's actually dangerous for people to be exposed to that mercury and it creates an environmental hazard. So now we have to recycle these light bulbs. Well, if you have a light bulb that goes bad in your organization, you're not going to immediately take that light bulb out and run it down to the recycling center. You're going to have to store it, okay? And the light bulbs are somewhat fragile, so you have to figure out a way that you can store it safely and not have a mess, okay? Then once you have a certain number of light bulbs, then maybe you figure out sending them out for recycling, or maybe there's certain dates that you do it. Okay, but that's all part of what it is you have to manage. If you think about employment regulations, I was in a management position at one point in time where I had some major issues with employment regulations. Okay, because we have issues as far as hiring minors in the workplace. Right, we can't hire minors into unsafe positions. They can't work in hazardous positions. And I was hired into a place where somebody had 16-year-olds operating forklifts. Okay, and the day-to-day business operations were based upon this happening. And I went in and I had to say, no, this cannot happen here. But that meant we had to make other shifts in what we did with our employees. It added complexity because we had to hire people. We had to shift when other people who could operate the forklifts could work, and so on and so forth. And then we have taxes, right? And organizations are always looking at what can we do and what's the impact on our taxes. So that adds another complexity to our management. Okay, but some of the benefits that we can think of here: protection of intellectual properties. All right, so 20 years ago we had Napster and LimeWire, and they were providing these sites where people were sharing music for free. And it was really disrupting the music industry because this intellectual property was just being shared. All right, but government regulations helped to manage that, helped to kind of put an end to this free music sharing. All right, if you have a product that you invent in the United States, you can patent that product and protect your product from having others make it before you have a chance to profit on it. Okay, we also have regulations that can limit competition. So, for example, in New York City, we have taxi medallions that limit the number of taxis that can be on the street, thus helping to protect that market for those who have already established themselves. Next, let's discuss some economic factors. Now, we've already talked a little bit about how interest and unemployment rates can impact organizations, right? So, if interest rates are low, then that opens up the opportunity for people to borrow and spend more and so on. And if unemployment rates are high, then there's a great market to hire employees. If unemployment rates are low, the market for hiring employees is not quite so great. Then we also have the stock market. Organizations often have to respond to the stock market, okay? And the reason for that is that we have CEOs who are our top executive leaders in our organizations, and they report to the board of directors. All right. And the board of directors essentially reports to the stockholders. All right. So if the stockholders are not happy with what they're getting on their investment, then that's going to have an impact on the board. That's going to have an impact on the CEO and so on. All right. And there are a variety of different things that the stock market will respond to. And we all know that the stock market's going to respond to sales and the stock market's going to respond to profitability, but the stock market responds to other indicators as well. And one of those indicators that you might not really think about is customer service surveys. Okay, so we've all gone to different retailers where on our receipt they offer us the opportunity to complete a survey and then maybe be entered into a drawing to win something and so on. And a lot of those surveys, if you've ever actually gone all the way through and taken them, have something on them called a likelihood to recommend score. Okay. And investors actually are known to respond to these LTR scores. So, what happens often is organizations will set targets for how they want each of their different locations to perform on these LTR scores. All right. And the focus actually starts to move away from the customer service that's being delivered and it starts to transition to how well the organizations are scoring because they're trying to please their stockholders. Technological advances also impact our organizations. Okay, so there's two key ways that we'll look at here. And the first one is they change the way we communicate. So we have Zoom, we have Microsoft Teams, we have Skype, we have WebEx. These are all different tools that have changed how organizations can communicate with each other. So we can more easily connect businesses in one location with businesses in a completely different location. All right. So I worked for a consulting company at one point in time that had offices in Albany, New York City, and Western New York. And there were actually managers who had direct reports in each one of those locations. So the managers weren't in the same locations as all of their direct reports, but it worked because that company relied on WebEx quite a bit for communication. So people were able to manage remotely. All right. We also have technological advances that result in creating new products. All right. And these new products can disrupt markets. And the example that I'm going to go over here with you today is looking at the electric car disrupting the automobile market. All right. So in 1997, the Toyota Prius became the first mass produced hybrid car. All right. If you're looking at this from a US centric perspective, you may remember Honda having a hybrid come in before the Prius, but that was after 1997, and that was only because the Prius had some delays in getting into the US. The Prius was the first mass-produced hybrid vehicle. Okay, then only 6 years later, Tesla was founded, and we all know Tesla as creator of the electric car. Okay, and if we look at fast forward from 2003 to 2021, and we look at the share that electric cars are making in the new car market, we can see that in countries like Norway and Iceland, it's pretty significant. In Norway, it's almost 75%. In Iceland, it's over 50. All right. For the world, we're just shy of 5%. All right. Now, we're seeing these numbers grow faster in some countries than in others. We have to remember that the infrastructure for the electric car was not there for a long time. It's only been in recent years that we've started to see charging stations really increase in popularity and so on. All right, but why this is important is because the automobile industry for about a century had relied solely on fossil fuel powered cars. And now all of a sudden we're starting to see market share get eaten up by an electric vehicle. So this technological advance is really having an impact on organizations. Changing demographics also impact our organizations as we're seeing increases in the diversity of our workforces. Okay, so we're seeing changes such as population growth, education, and skill level differences, immigration, gender composition in the workplace. And what do all these things mean for our organizations? Well, for one, it means that we can no longer assume that all of our employees are going to have the same desires and the same needs as us. Okay, if we have a diverse workforce, we can expect that our workforce is going to have diverse needs. And as managers, we need to be thinking about how can we meet the diverse needs of our workforce. We also have to think about how can we make sure that we have equity in our workplace practices. Okay, so how can we make sure that our performance evaluations are equitable? And this is key because performance evaluations determine promotions, they determine raises, and so on. So, changing demographics are also having some very strong impacts on our organizations. Societal trends also impact our organizations, okay? And in many ways they'll impact us from the perspective of society's expectations change and our behaviors change in response, but sometimes societal trends impact us because of how we engage in conversations about these trends. So if we think back to 2017, immigration was a very important topic in the United States at that point in time. It was something people felt very passionately about. There were clearly two different perspectives on how this should be addressed, and it was a point of conversation over and over and over again. And in 2017, there was a Super Bowl commercial that was put forth by 84 Lumber Company that somewhat addressed immigration. And initially, the commercial was deemed too controversial for television. In fact, Fox would not air the entire commercial. 84 split the commercial up so that you could watch part of it on TV and then you were told to finish the story by going to their website. And no matter what side of the issue people were on, people were very interested in this commercial. It drove a lot of traffic to their website. It drove so much traffic to their website that the website crashed and the company had to scramble to get the website back up and running. In addition to that, it also had an impact on their business. Okay, I can tell you that one of my former employees texted me shortly after the commercial aired, a few days after the commercial aired, and talked to me about the fact that they had some customers that were not necessarily supportive of the commercial and were considering whether or not they wanted to pull their business. So I kind of exchanged a little bit of idea sharing with some of my employees and told them how I thought they could navigate some of these situations. And ultimately, the one in particular that I'm thinking of was able to retain their accounts and was able to work through things without much of a problem. But it was something that the company had to carefully look at in terms of how they navigated the situation. Next, we're going to take a look at the competitive environment. And this refers to our immediate environment, including suppliers, customers, and rivals. Within the competitive environment, one of the most popular frameworks that you'll see is called Porter's Five Forces. And this deals with five forces that Porter said really framed competition. Okay, so Porter said there was rivalry amongst existing competitors. All right, there's also the threat of new entrants. All right, and there's a variety of things that can keep new entrants out of a business, but there are also situations where it's very easy for new organizations to enter a business. And whether it's easy or not to get into a business impacts how high that threat is. Okay. We also have the bargaining power of buyers. All right. So when I was in industry, we had some very large accounts that we didn't want to lose. And those accounts could really force us to do some things. Okay. So maybe they wanted us to change our delivery schedule to meet their needs. Well, we might go ahead and do it so we didn't lose a $2 million account. Okay. A much smaller account, an account that only spent 10, $15,000 a year, we might not have been willing to make that same concession for. All right. We have the bargaining power of suppliers. Okay. So sometimes suppliers have a product and they know we want it, and there's nothing that we can do. We don't have anywhere else to go. All right. So in my industry, we had a lot of products that were proprietary in nature, and we only had one source that we could go to for these products. And if the manufacturer, if the company had done a good enough job selling consumers on wanting that product, then they were pretty firm in knowing that if we wanted to satisfy our consumer, we had to buy from them. And that gave the suppliers a lot of bargaining power. All right. There's also the threat of substitute products or services. All right. So if I don't buy your product, can I go get another one? If someone doesn't buy my product, can they get a different product somewhere else? Now, it's very important that we identify our competition as we walk through different types of competitors. I made some examples over here on the right-hand side of the competitive environment if we were looking to purchase lock sets in southern Vermont. Okay, so we'll start with we have our small domestic firms, and in this example, we have Adams Lock and Security, which is on Main Street in Bennington, Vermont. They have one location, a few employees, very small operation. Okay, then we have our strong regional competitors, and in this example, that would be RK Miles, who has a main location in Manchester, Vermont, which is in Bennington County. They have other locations in Vermont. They have a few locations in Massachusetts, I believe, but they are not a national company. They're very tightly centralized in that southern Vermont area. Okay, then we have big new domestic companies exploring markets. And for my example here, I have the Home Depot who moved into Bennington, Vermont, not all that long ago, probably about 15, 20 years ago. Okay, and they're obviously a much larger company. They have hundreds of locations in the United States. I think actually up to about 2,000. Now they are becoming global at this point, as they have some locations in Mexico and Canada and a few in China. All right, but I use them as my example for a domestic company exploring new markets. We have our global firms. Here I have Amazon, because we can buy our lock sets on Amazon as well, and Amazon is obviously a global firm. And then a newer venture would just be a new company that would pop up. And each of these different types of competition has some competitive advantages to it, and they all have some opportunities as well. You also need to know how your competitors compete. So if we think about companies like Walmart and the Home Depot, they really focus on price reductions, right? And being very cost competitive. All right. And then we have companies that use new product introductions. So Apple would be a great example of that, as they always have new products coming out. Then we have companies like Nike that are focused on great advertising campaigns. Now, you're more likely to see new entrants into your market when barriers to entry are low. And what that means is there aren't things that are keeping organizations out. So what are some of the things that could keep organizations out of an industry? Well, government policy is one of them. Okay, so government policy, we would think maybe in the food industry. Okay, there's certain safety regulations that we need to maintain. If I want to start, some type of a food company, maybe I want to start a cookie company. I can't just be baking cookies in my home kitchen without meeting certain regulations, right? So the government policy there could be a barrier to entry. We have capital requirements, which is basically, how much money do we have, right? So if we look at the airline industry, we have Boeing and we have Airbus, right? They're the two major manufacturers of 747 large commercial planes. All right. It's very hard to get into that industry because you need a lot of capital to get into that. Even if we look at some smaller companies, take a look at a Sports Clips that's a franchise, right? There's barriers to entry there as well, because if you look at what they need, what they're going to require if you want to open one of their franchises, you have to have a net worth of $400,000, liquid assets of $200,000. They estimate that the cost for opening a franchise will be somewhere between $250,000 and $400,000. Okay, we have brand identification. If you wanted to open a sneaker company, you're competing against Nike, Under Armour, Adidas. How are you going to get people to recognize your shoe when you're going up against those brands? Think about cost disadvantages. Okay, so companies like Walmart, Target, Home Depot, Lowe's, they have incredible buying power, right? So if you want to get into one of their markets, how are you going to compete with them price wise when they have that incredible buying power that's going to help them get low costs on their products. Okay, and then we have distribution channels. All right, so if you've ever bought groceries, you've gone into the grocery store, you see ketchup, right? There's a bunch of different brands. You got Hunt's, you got Heinz, maybe a few others. And each one of those brands might have different styles of ketchup. Like there might be a jalapeno ketchup in there. You have different bottle sizes, right? But there's not really a lot of empty shelf space there because there's all sorts of different brands, all sorts of different types of ketchup, all sorts of different bottle sizes, and so on. If I wanted to open a ketchup company, I would have to figure out how am I going to get the supermarkets to give me some of that space? And that's a distribution channel issue. As we purchase our materials, we have different types of customers. So in this case, I use an example of a TV, and I need to buy a new TV. I broke a TV recently while moving. So when I go out to the store and I finally buy a new TV, I will be the final consumer because I will be the last person to purchase that TV and I will be the person who's going to use it. All right. Let's say I go to Walmart to buy that TV. Walmart will be the intermediate consumer. And the reason for that is that Walmart is selling to me, but they're purchasing the TV from someone else. Okay. And then let's say that TV happens to be the brand on. They're going to be a B2B company. Okay. Because they're a business and they're selling to Walmart, who is also a business. They are not selling directly to me. So they're going to be a B2B company. Now, we all know that customers help determine our success, but what does that really mean? When you think about customer service, I want you to think about giving customers what they want when they want it and getting it right the first time, okay? I have a note in here that service is not just about being nice because so many people think that if you're nice to customers, that's good customer service. No, that's being interpersonally nice. Okay, being interpersonally nice is not synonymous with good customer service. And if you think about it, close your eyes and think about your favorite restaurant, okay? Now, imagine you go into your favorite restaurant, everybody's super nice to you, they treat you well, but your food is late, it comes cold, and it's wrong all the time. Eventually, you're not going to feel like you got good service because nobody wants to get the wrong order constantly. Nobody wants cold food. Nobody wants things to be late. It doesn't matter if they're being nice. So we need to make sure we're getting people what they want, getting it to them fast and right the first time. Okay, so within our customer service, we think about speed or getting things quickly, meeting emergency needs. If somebody's in a pickle, how do you help them? I had a faucet part break one night. I got down to Lowe's at 9:01. They were closed. They let me in. They let me buy the part I needed. They got me out. Okay, that was meeting an emergency need. Merchandise condition, is stuff coming in damaged or is it coming in the right condition? Is it coming in new the way you expect it to be? Can I return something? Can I replace it if I have a problem? Okay, if I need help with installation or repair, is there some sort of service that will help with that? And what are the charges for these services? Those are all elements of customer service. Now, earlier we talked about the threat of substitutes, and a substitute product is something that we can get instead of what we would typically get from our supplier. All right, so if you think about maybe you really want to get a Big Mac, okay? Well, you go to McDonald's and the line is 20 deep, the drive through line is really long, and you don't have time to wait for the Big Mac. But you look across the street at Burger King and it doesn't look like there's anybody there, so you decide, hey, I'm going to go get a Whopper instead of the Big Mac. Well, that Whopper is a substitute product for the Big Mac in this example. Now, not all of our competitors' products are going to be substitute products. Sometimes we can have what's called a complement. And in this example, we'll take a look at Bostitch and Porter-Cable. Bostitch and Porter-Cable are rivals in the nail gun industry. Okay, so they both are in this business where they sell a tool called a nail gun, which basically allows you to put nails into wood by just pulling a trigger instead of using a hammer. All right. Now, I own a Bostitch nail gun, and it looks a lot like the one over here on the left. All right, now you'll notice this is a straight nail gun. There's no angle here, and it takes a nail size that's called 16 gauge. Okay, now Bostitch sells those nails, but whenever I go out and buy nails for my nail gun, I always buy Porter Cable 16 gauge straight nails. Now, why do I buy the Porter Cable nails instead of Bostic? Well, they're easier to find. I think they're a little bit cheaper usually when I see them there. And I think I can also buy smaller boxes if I want to. So even though Porter Cable lost out on the nail gun purchase, I didn't buy a Porter Cable nail gun. They won on the nail purchases because their nails complement their competitor's product. Within our competitive environment, we also have suppliers, and suppliers provide the resources that we need for production. So, for example, we need people to work in our organizations, and we find those people through trade schools and universities. They train our employees for us, right? We need raw materials, and we'll get those from producers of product. We'll get them from wholesalers. We'll get them from distributors. All right. Sometimes we need information, and we have researchers and consulting firms who can provide that. And lastly, we need financial capital, and banks and investors can be great sources of capital for our businesses. One way that suppliers can be at a competitive advantage is if there are switching costs associated with their products. So, what is a switching cost? What a switching cost means basically is if I want to change vendors or I want to change suppliers, there's some type of expense that I'm going to incur. Okay, so at a personal level, I'll give you an example here. I need a new hammer drill. Okay, I got to do some concrete work. I got to drill through the concrete. I need a new drill that can handle that. All right, now most of my battery powered tools are all Ryobi tools. I've been looking at some hammer tools that are different manufacturers. But the problem is that all my tools take the same battery. And if I go buy a drill that takes a different battery, then I can't use that battery on my old tools. I can't use my old tools battery on my new tool, and so on and so forth. That's a switching cost. Okay, back 10 years ago, there were switching costs to go between Apple and Windows, okay, because they weren't as compatible as they are today. All right. Then we also have our supply chain management here. All right. And supply chain management is critical to our organizations. All right. And people are thinking about supply chain management a little bit different today than they used to. All right. There's a strong focus on just in time inventory, meaning that we want to keep as little product on hand as we can and replenish our product as it goes out the door. Now, why would we want to do this? Imagine you were running a grocery store. Would you want to keep 6 months worth of lettuce in your store at a time? Absolutely not, because the lettuce is going to wilt, it's going to go bad, you can't sell it. Well, we're seeing the same things happen with our technologies. All right. If technology sits too long, new technologies come out, and then our old technology becomes obsolete. So if we're sitting on that technology in our inventory, that's a little bit problematic. Within our competitive environment, there can also be environmental uncertainty. And this is when management lacks the information to understand or predict the future. All right, and uncertainty can arise from complexity or the number of issues that a manager has to handle, or it can arise from dynamism or the degree of discontinuous change that occurs within the industry. Now, what do we mean by discontinuous change? Well, let's take a look at two different industries. Okay, over here on the left, we have a stable industry. All right, this is the fossil fuel industry. This industry has been pretty stable for a while. You know, as we discussed earlier in the lecture, automobiles have relied on fossil fuels for a century at this point. We aren't seeing many great changes here. All right, we have the same type of gasoline over and over and over again. Now, yes, we'll see different octanes. Occasionally, we might see, gasoline that has 10% ethanol, but there hasn't been a major change in terms of what this fuel looks like. Then over on the right, we have an unstable industry, and this is the technology industry. And we're looking at smartphones here, and smartphones have changed the way that the industry behaves completely, right? So there's all sorts of new innovations coming up here, and things can change almost on a moment's notice, it seems like at times, right? So one day we're looking at the Motorola Razor as being the coolest phone out there, and then the next day we have the iPhone. Okay, so that's an example of an industry that has a high degree of discontinuous change. One way that managers can help understand their environment is through environmental scanning. And this is where we search for and sort through information about our environment. And this helps us gain competitive intelligence or information that tells us how to manage in our environment. Okay, so for example, when I was a manager at one point in time, we were having some problems selling a specific product. So I entered into some environmental scanning where I did some reconnaissance work on our competitors' pricing. And once we had this pricing information, that gave us some competitive intelligence that told our organization how we had to price our products. Now, I want you to think about what type of information could you see yourself searching for in your first management position. Now, we can evaluate whether or not an environment is attractive or not through the lens of Porter's five forces. So let's take a look here and we can look at competitors. If there are few competitors, an environment's going to be a lot more attractive than if there are a lot of competitors. Along those lines, if the threat of entry is low, that's going to be much more attractive than if the threat of entry is high. All right, if we have few competitors and it's hard for competitors to get in, that's a very attractive environment when we combine those two features. What about substitutes? If there aren't a lot of substitutes, that's very attractive. If people can replace our product with a lot of other things, not so attractive. All right, now think about suppliers and customers. If there are a lot of them, they have low bargaining power. That's going to be fairly attractive. If there are a few of them, they're going to have higher bargaining power, and that's going to be a little bit less attractive. Now, managers can also plan for unknown cases in the environment through work in scenarios. Okay. And when we work in scenarios, we try to think of what is a best case situation, a worst case situation, what would our response be in different scenarios. Right. So we could start with, well, what if we have a sales increase? That's our best case scenario. Well, what if our sales go down? That's our worst case scenario. If we have a sales increase, we might need to increase our staff. We might be able to increase our staff. Alternatively, we might not be able to increase our staff and we could have a staffing shortage. All right. If we have a sales decrease, we might have to have some layoffs, but maybe we have a reason that we can't lay people off. Okay. And then we have to look at alternative cuts. All right. These are just examples of how we could work through different types of scenarios. So, right now, we're in the COVID-19 pandemic, right? All right. And we are seeing a little bit of an increase in cases in the area that I live in. And today in my kid's school, there was a teachers meeting. And one of the things that the teachers were discussing in the meeting is what are we going to do if we have to stop teaching in person and start teaching remote again? And that's another example of working through scenarios. Another thing that managers can do to work through uncertainties is they forecast. All right. And this is how we predict future variables in order to plan for changes in the future. When I was in industry, I used to have to forecast my sales based upon the forecast of sales. We would forecast our labor demands. Then we would also forecast our labor supply, look at the difference, and identify what our hiring needs were. All right. Now, often our forecasts are based upon the past. And when the future resembles the past, things with our forecast tend to go very, very smoothly. All right. But if the future is different from the past, our forecasts become a lot more important. Unfortunately, in these situations where our forecasts are important, because the future is different from the past, the forecasts also tend to be less accurate. In other words, when our forecasts are most important is when they tend to be the least accurate. Organizations will also engage in a process called benchmarking. All right, and this is when we compare our organization to another comparable rival. All right, and I've got Home Depot and Lowe's as examples here because if you ever walk in one store and then go look at the other, you'll notice that their products are priced almost identically right down to the penny. Okay, because Home Depot does a very good job of benchmarking against Lowe's, and Lowe's does a very good job of benchmarking against Home Depot. Now, this gives them some advantages because each company makes sure that the other one doesn't get a competitive advantage in a lot of different ways. All right. The one downside to this, however, though, is because these two organizations spend so much time benchmarking against each other, sometimes other smaller rivals gain advantages that might go unnoticed. Now that we've taken a look at a few ways that we can evaluate our environment, we're going to look at how can we respond to it. And three types of responses that we might look at are adapting to the environment, influencing the environment, or selecting a new environment. Now, our organizational structure should reflect the environment that we're competing in. All right. So we may look at, is our environment stable or is it dynamic? Now, if it's stable and we can count on things to be relatively consistent throughout the environment, then what we may choose to do is we may choose to have a more bureaucratic structure. All right. And the reason for that is that we can set a firm structure with rules and guidelines. And we know that there aren't going to be too many problems posed by that in our environment. If our environment's a little more dynamic though, meaning that it's always changing or frequently changing, we may want a more organic structure because we may not want to be stuck in a bureaucratic structure in something that's going to be a little less malleable. All right. So then we also could have a complex environment or a simple environment. In a simple environment, we expect that things are going to be fairly consistent from location to location and so on and so forth. So we can have centralized decision making. Okay, so maybe somebody in our corporate offices can make major decisions that impacts all of our locations and all of our departments and so on. If we have a little more of a complex environment, let's say there are different needs in different geographic areas, then we may choose to decentralize our decision making. Okay, so we may choose to let people in our locations actually make decisions. And remember that when we decentralize decision making, we are empowering employees or sharing power with employees to help them enhance their contribution to the organization. Organizations can also use strategies such as buffering and smoothing to help prepare for environmental uncertainties. And buffering is when we create an excess of supplies. All right. So maybe what we do is we've hired what we need, we think, for our organization, but we've also connected with a staffing organization so that if we become short staffed, they can easily help us replenish our staffing needs. All right. Then we also have something called smoothing, which is just leveling our normal fluctuations and the boundaries in the environment. In other words, maybe we have a business where we're very seasonal. And if we were to look at our sales, they tend to go kind of like this throughout the year. All right. Now, if we were to smooth that, we're going to try to figure out ways that we can add sales in these gaps so that we're a little bit more consistent and we can be prepared to have similar staffing resources throughout the year. One way to do that might be through having end of season sales. Another way to do it might be through having extended advertising campaigns. But all these things would be examples of smoothing where we try to do things to level out our normal functionality of the business. We can also look at how do we engage in flexible processes. Now, we've talked about Henry Ford a few times in this course, and one of Ford's famous quotes was, any customer can have a car painted any color he wants as long as it's black. And that was Ford's way of joking about the fact that the Model T only came in black. Well, that type of mentality doesn't work today, right? So if you were to look at a Ford truck today, the Ford truck's going to be offered in more than 10 colors, okay, as we could see over here on the left-hand side. All right. Now, how do we do that and maintain our manufacturing efficiencies? Well, that's where adapting at the core and our flexible processes come into play. So we figure out how to mass produce in a custom way. All right. So different parts are mass produced. And then the only thing that might be different between these is the actual color, right? So we're mass producing the same steering wheels and the same dashboard and the same wheels and so on for all of these cars, but the color components are being mass produced individually. Now, organizations can use a variety of independent strategies to influence their environment. And these independent strategies can include competitive aggression, competitive pacification, public relations, voluntary action, legal action, and political action. Now, organizations can also use cooperative strategies. All right. And some cooperative strategies are things that we're going to do that help us manage the external environment together, like contracts. All right. So the NFL and the NFL Players Association, they sign contracts that basically govern how the league and its players are going to work together in order to be successful in the market. Then we also have co-optation. All right. And co-optation is basically about acquiring resources. All right, so for fans of The Office, an example of co-optation. Now, this one's not really all that cooperative, but it would be if you go back to season 7. Michael hired a salesperson named Danny Cordray. Danny was the best salesperson in the Scranton market, and Dunder Mifflin was having trouble competing with him. So they went ahead and they just hired him. They brought him on to help get his business. Okay. An example here that would be a little more cooperative that has to do with cooptation would deal with the Michael Scott Paper Company. All right. So Michael Scott had left Dunder Mifflin. He had started his own paper company. The company was causing problems for Dunder Mifflin, and Dunder Mifflin realized that the easiest way to deal with the Michael Scott Paper Company was not to fight with them, but simply to buy them out. And the Michael Scott Paper Company became part of Dunder Mifflin. Okay, we can also form coalitions. And coalitions are basically when different actors in the environment or different businesses join together and work together for a cause. So in Vermont, where I lived for 10 years in Bennington, Vermont, they used to have an event called the Day Under the Dome. And this was organized by the local Chamber of Commerce. And what they did was they basically got members of the Chamber of Commerce who were local business owners, and they rented a bus and they all went up to Montpelier to the state capitol, and they basically lobbied for some of the things that as a community business owners felt that they needed from their legislators. Organizations can also engage in strategic maneuvering or efforts to change the boundaries of their environment. All right, so one type of strategic maneuvering is domain selection. And this is where you get into a new market or industry where you already have expertise. All right, so the example that I have here deals with ABF Freight Company. All right, now ABF is a trucking company, and basically what they typically do is they haul materials from suppliers to vendors, right? To retail stores. So they might go to a warehouse and pick up a bunch of crates of clothing and then bring that to a Kohl's and drop it off, for example. All right. So ABF has some expertise in the trucking industry. All right. Where they were not, however, was they weren't involved in moving. So ABF opened up a business called UPAC, and it used their trailers, their drivers, their expertise in the area, and basically, what they started doing was delivering trailers to people's houses, letting people load the houses when they were if they were moving, and then ABF would pick up the trailer and they would drive it to the new house. So they were using the expertise that they already had to go from commercial trucking business into the moving business. All right, now diversification is when you invest in a completely different area, a different business, geographic area, and so on. So if ABF was to expand into a new country, that would be an example of diversification. Building on our discussion of diversification, we can take a look at Walmart. Now, Walmart has obviously diversified by opening up locations across the United States, as we can see by looking at this map here. Okay. But Walmart has also diversified by expanding its product lines. Walmart started as a retail goods store, expanded into garden centers, grocery, auto service, pharmacy, and even financial services. Organizations can also engage in mergers, acquisitions, and divestiture. All right, so mergers happen when one or more companies simply combine with each other. Okay. More often, we will see acquisitions, and this is when one firm buys another. So back in 1998, Harley Davidson wanted to get more into the sport bike industry, and they acquired Buell. Okay. Now, then in 2009, Harley decided that it needed to cut costs. This was during a financial downturn. And at that point in time, Harley divested itself of Buell. And what that means is it sold off the business. Now, in this case, it didn't sell Buell to another buyer, it actually liquidated Buell, so Buell ceased to exist from there on out. Now, more recently, Harley has decided it wanted to get back into the sport bike industry, so it acquired Augusta MV, an Italian motorcycle company. Now, when it comes to boundary spanning, there are typically two different types of managers. All right. We have prospectors, and these are the people who are consistently trying to change their boundaries. They're seeking out new products, new markets, maybe looking for how they can diversify or merge with another company or acquire another company. All right. Then we have defenders, And these are our managers who kind of want to stay stable within the product domain that they've been established in. And that's a strategic decision on their part. So, what's the right approach for responding to your environment for you? Well, for starters, you need to change what matters and what can be changed. Some things can't be changed. You can't focus on things that can't be changed. All right. You need to use the most appropriate response. Different responses are going to be more appropriate for different situations. And then finally, you need to choose responses that offer the most benefit at the lowest cost. Now, we've talked a lot about the external environment, so now let's talk a little bit about the internal environment. And this refers to all the relevant forces inside your boundaries. So, your managers, your employees, different resources, and your organizational culture. Within our internal boundaries, one of the most important things that we can think about is our organizational culture. And this is our set of assumptions and beliefs about the organization and its goals that members of the organization share. All right. Now, the culture has three different components to it. We have visible artifacts. Now, this is the part that we actually see. So, we've talked before about Zappos and its organizational culture. So let's think about Zappos. If you were to walk into Zappos's offices, you're going to see a lot of like crazy stuff going on. There's decorations hanging from the ceilings. People might have stuffed animals and toys and cartoon stuff all over the place. These are all visible artifacts of Zappos's culture. Now, that's just what you can see, but the true elements of the culture lie beneath that. All right. So then we have values. All right. And these are the desirable qualities and behaviors that we have within the organization. So at Zappos, people believe in delivering what they call wow to the customer. That's a core belief. Deliver wow to the customer. That's one of their values. All right. And then we have our unconscious assumptions. And these are the deeply held beliefs that kind of get taken for granted. So maybe employees at Zappos believe that everybody wants to take care of the customer. Okay, maybe they believe that everybody wants to have fun at work. These would be examples of unconscious assumptions. Now, not all organizations have strong cultures. Zappos is a great example of a company with a strong culture because the majority of their employees understand and believe in what it is the firm is trying to do and the meaning that the firm finds in itself. Okay. Some companies have weak cultures, all right, and there different people have different values, and there can be kind of confusion about what the corporate goals are, and the way people behave can be very inconsistent. And one company I worked for early in my career had a very weak culture. We had some people who only focused on work. Okay, if you were talking about anything other than work during the day, they thought you were being unprofessional. I had another coworker there who used to pick up his phone, go on the intercom, and sing happy birthday to people all the time. All right. Now we had these very different ways of behaving in this organization because we had a weak culture. So, how do we know what a corporate culture looks like? Okay, so our corporate mission statements and our goals can help give us a little bit of a clue there. I actually quoted one of Zappos's public values on the previous slide. We can look at our business practices. So, when Zappos says they're going to deliver wow to customers, what does that mean? Well, Tony Hsieh once, when meeting with investors, wanted to show them how good Zappos's customer service was. He called the company, didn't tell them who he was, put him on speakerphone, asked them to help him find a pizzeria in the middle of the night where he was at his meeting because he was having trouble finding a pizzeria. The Zappos associate not only found a pizzeria, but they took his credit card, ordered the pizza, and had it delivered for him. They didn't know they were talking to Tony Hsieh, but every investor there that day invested because they saw what their business practices look like and they believed in that company's culture. We have symbols, rites, ceremonies. So what are we celebrating? Okay, what are we doing in our organizations that shows us about culture? And then think about the stories that people tell. When I was at Home Depot, we had a training manual that had stories in it, and one of the stories talked all about a department supervisor who had a customer that was looking for a product and they didn't have the product in the store, and he drove around from store to store to store to store till he found the product and picked it up and brought it back to his store and then got it to the customer. And that was a story that the company shared with all of its new managers to make sure they understood how important service was to the company's culture. So, how can we use our organizational culture to achieve our strategic goals? Well, if we're looking to achieve flexible processes while focusing on internal maintenance, often we'll engage in a culture type called the clan. And this is a culture that is intended to collaborate, and it focuses on development, trust, and participation. Now, let's say we want to focus on internal maintenance just like the clan, but we want more control oriented processes. Then we're going to end up in a culture that gets referred to as the hierarchy. And here we focus on stability, compliance, and elements of bureaucracy. Okay. Now, if we want to look at control oriented processes, but we really want to focus on our external positioning, then we might engage in what's called the market culture. And the market culture focuses on productivity, planning, and efficiency. And then finally, if we were focused on external positioning, but needed flexible processes, then we could engage in what's called the adhocracy. All right. And this focuses on growth, change, and innovation. In building our culture, we're going to want to make sure that we clearly articulate what it is that we want to do. And part of how we can do that is through an inspirational vision of what can be for the culture. All right, then it's critical that we walk the talk. In other words, managers need to do the things that they want to see from others in their organization to demonstrate that we're serious about this and we care about this. Okay, you also want to celebrate and reward members who behave in the ways that you want them to behave. Okay, this helps incentivize people to do what you want to do with your organizational culture. And then finally, we need to have hiring and socializing practices that really help engage people in the culture. We need to hire the right people. We need to teach people the right things right when they join the company. And we need to promote people for embracing our culture. And that's also going to help build the culture that we're looking for. Thanks for joining us here today for this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon.